The strange thing about losing your marriage is that sometimes nobody leaves. Sometimes they just stop seeing you. The night my wife introduced me as her roommate, everyone laughed, including her. And that was the moment I realized I had spent years fighting for a marriage that only one of us still believed existed. My name is Grant Sullivan. I'm 46 years old, born and raised in Ohio, and for most of my adult life, I thought consistency was a virtue. I believed showing up mattered. I believed paying the bills on time, fixing what broke, keeping promises, and putting family first were the kinds of things that built a strong marriage. Maybe they do. But what nobody tells you is that a marriage can slowly disappear while everything on the outside still looks perfectly fine. The night it happened was at a birthday party for one of Claire's closest friends. Nothing fancy, just a rented event room above a restaurant outside Columbus. About 30 people. Soft country music playing through ceiling speakers. String lights hanging along the walls. The smell of barbecue drifting in from the patio every time someone opened the door. The kind of gathering we've attended hundreds of times over the years. Familiar faces. Familiar conversations. Familiar smiles. Looking back, I should have noticed how comfortable Claire seemed without me. Not unhappy. Not angry. Just completely detached. She moved easily from one conversation to another, laughing, touching people's arms when she talked, telling stories. She looked beautiful that night. Navy blue dress. Silver earrings I'd bought her 3 Christmases ago. The same smile that used to make me feel like the luckiest man in the room. I remember standing near the bar nursing a club soda because I had an early meeting the next morning. A few couples were gathered around one of the high-top tables. Somebody started joking about long marriages. One of those harmless conversations people have once they hit their 40s and realize everyone suddenly has teenagers, mortgages, and lower back pain. Someone pointed toward Claire and me. 21 years, right? He asked. What's the secret? A few people laughed. Somebody else added, you two still look like newlyweds. More laughter. I smiled politely. Claire rolled her eyes. Then she said it. Please. She laughed into her wine glass. Grant isn't my husband anymore. He's basically my roommate with a wedding ring. The table exploded with laughter. Real laughter. The kind that fills a room. Somebody nearly spilled their drink. Another person slapped the table, and Claire laughed right along with them. I smiled. That's what people do. They smile when they're embarrassed. They smile when they're hurt. They smile when they don't want strangers watching them bleed. But something inside me became very still. It's hard to explain. I wasn't angry. Not immediately. I wasn't shocked either. The truth is, part of me had known for years. Her words didn't create the wound. They just removed the bandage. Claire kept talking. The conversation moved on. Someone made another joke. Music kept playing. Waiters carried trays of appetizers through the room. Life continued exactly as it had 30 seconds earlier. But I couldn't stop hearing those words. Roommate. Not husband. Not partner. Not best friend. Roommate. Funny how a single word can suddenly organize years of confusion. I looked around the room. Nobody thought anything unusual had happened. To them it was a joke. To Claire it was probably a joke too. But standing there beneath those warm lights, watching people laugh, I started replaying the last few years of my life. The separate schedules. The canceled date nights. The conversations that never got deeper than grocery lists and home repairs. The way she'd started sitting on the opposite end of the couch. The way her phone always seemed more interesting than anything I had to say. The way she'd stopped reaching for my hand years ago, and I had convinced myself that was normal. Funny what people can normalize when they're afraid to ask hard questions. I took a slow sip from my glass. The ice had already melted. Across the room, Claire was smiling again, completely unaware that something fundamental had shifted. Not in our marriage. That shift had happened long before. Inside me. Because for the first time in years, I stopped trying to explain her behavior. I stopped making excuses. I stopped telling myself things would eventually get better. Standing there in that crowded room, surrounded by laughter, I finally accepted something I should have understood a long time ago. If my wife truly saw me as her roommate, then maybe it was time I stopped acting like her husband. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though it was only 20 minutes. Claire sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone while streetlights drifted across the windshield in slow yellow patterns. Every few seconds the screen lit up against her face. She smiled at something she read. Maybe a message from a friend. Maybe a photograph from the party. Maybe nothing important at all. Funny how your mind starts noticing details once it stops chasing explanations. The radio played softly. A weather report. A country song. Traffic updates. Ordinary sounds filling the silence where a marriage used to live. Claire finally glanced over. "You are quiet tonight." I kept my eyes on the road. "Long week." She nodded and went back to her phone. That was it. No questions. No curiosity. No concern. Just another small exchange between two people sharing a vehicle. Looking back, that moment stayed with me more than the joke itself. Not because she failed some test, because I realized she genuinely did not notice anything had changed. We pulled into the driveway a little after 10. The porch light cast a pale circle across the front lawn. The maple tree near the mailbox swayed in the October wind. Home looked exactly the way it always had. Safe, stable, familiar. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Claire headed upstairs after a quick goodnight. No kiss. No lingering conversation. Just routine. I stood alone in the kitchen listening to the house settle around me. The refrigerator hummed softly. The dishwasher blinked green numbers from across the room. Somewhere upstairs a bathroom cabinet closed. 21 years. It is strange what survives in a marriage. The furniture survives. The photographs survive. The mortgage survives. Sometimes everything survives except the connection itself. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we had celebrated promotions, birthdays, anniversaries, and school achievements. The same table where we once stayed up until midnight talking about dreams we could barely afford. Back then, Claire used to laugh at everything. We would sit here drinking coffee on Saturday mornings planning vacations we could not take yet. We talked about children, careers, houses. The future felt huge. Somewhere along the way those conversations disappeared. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, like a radio station fading as you drive farther from the signal. I stared at the wedding photo hanging near the hallway. We looked so young. Claire's smile reached her eyes back then. Mine probably did too. The truth was I could not remember the last time we had spent an evening together without a television, a phone, or a schedule sitting between us. That realization should have hurt more than it did. Instead, it felt clarifying, like finally reading the correct diagnosis after years of treating the wrong problem. For a long time, I believed I needed to work harder, be more patient, be more understanding. If something felt distant, I assumed it was my responsibility to close the gap. But sitting there alone, I began replaying the past few years with uncomfortable honesty. Every dinner I planned that got canceled, every conversation cut short, every attempt to reconnect met with polite indifference. None of it happened because we were busy. Busy people still make time for what matters. Around midnight, I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs. Claire was already asleep. At least she appeared to be. The glow from her phone charger cast a faint blue light across the nightstand. I stood there for a moment looking at the empty space between us. Not physical space. Emotional space. The kind that grows 1 inch at a time until it becomes impossible to ignore. I climbed into bed carefully and stared at the ceiling. The room felt familiar, but different. Not colder. Clearer. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to save what we had. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. What if I was the only one still trying? And if that was true, how much longer was I willing to live like a husband to someone who had already decided I was something else? The answer did not arrive that night, but the question stayed with me. And once a man starts asking the right question, his life usually begins to change. The next few days passed with the kind of normalcy that only exists when something important has already broken and nobody else knows it yet. Monday morning arrived right on schedule. My alarm went off at 6. Coffee brewed at 6:15. I drove 40 minutes to the distribution center outside Columbus and spent the day reviewing shipping reports, inventory forecasts, and staffing schedules. On paper, nothing had changed. But once you start seeing the truth, it becomes impossible to unsee it. I found myself noticing things I had ignored for years. Claire and I no longer shared stories about our day. We exchanged information, utility bills, grocery needs, appointment reminders. The relationship felt less like a marriage and more like two coworkers managing a property together. Tuesday evening, I came home carrying takeout from a local Italian place we both used to love. Years ago, bringing home dinner would have turned into an hour-long conversation at the kitchen table. That night, Claire thanked me, ate in front of the television, and spent most of the meal responding to messages on her phone. She was not being cruel. That was the strange part. There was no obvious villain in the story I was beginning to understand. No dramatic argument. No betrayal. No explosion. Just years of emotional distance accumulating one quiet day at a time. Looking back, I realized the warning signs had been everywhere. I had simply chosen not to name them. There was the anniversary dinner she rescheduled because of a networking event. The vacation we postponed 3 summers in a row until eventually nobody mentioned it anymore. The photographs where she gradually stopped standing close enough for our shoulders to touch. Small things. Harmless things when viewed individually. But marriages are not usually lost in a single moment. They disappear through accumulation. One missed conversation. One canceled plan. One unanswered attempt at connection. Then another. Then another. Wednesday night, I found an old storage box in the garage while searching for extension cords. Inside were photo albums from our early years together. Real photographs. The kind people printed before everything lived inside a phone. I carried the box inside and sat at the dining room table flipping through memories that felt like they belonged to different people. There was Claire laughing beside a lake in Michigan. Claire covered in paint while we renovated our first house. Claire sitting on the hood of my old pickup truck holding 2 milkshakes after a county fair. I could practically hear her laughter coming off those pages. What struck me most was not how much she had changed. It was how much effort we used to make. We used to create memories intentionally. We used to choose each other. Somewhere along the way, convenience replaced connection. Routine replaced curiosity. Around 9 o'clock, Claire walked through the dining room and noticed the albums spread across the table. She glanced at them for a few seconds. "I forgot we still had those," she said. Then she smiled politely and continued upstairs. That was all. I sat there staring at the staircase long after she disappeared from view. Years ago, she would have sat beside me. We would have laughed at old hairstyles and bad decorating choices. We would have spent an hour remembering things together. Instead, she barely slowed down. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have. Thursday morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The parking lot was still half empty. A cold autumn wind pushed dry leaves across the pavement. I sat in my truck for several minutes before going inside. Not because I was avoiding work. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was being honest with myself. The painful truth was that I had spent years measuring the health of my marriage by its survival. We were still married. We still lived together. We still attended family gatherings. Therefore, everything must be fine. But survival and connection are not the same thing. A house can remain standing long after it stops feeling like a home. That morning, as sunlight climbed over the warehouse rooftops, another realization settled quietly into place. I had spent years trying to earn affection that used to be given freely. And the more I thought about it, the more one question refused to leave me alone. If Claire truly saw me as a permanent fixture in her life, something as predictable as furniture or a utility bill, what would happen if I stopped organizing my world around keeping her comfortable? For the first time in years, that question did not scare me. It felt like the beginning of an answer. The decision did not arrive with drama. There was no confrontation in the kitchen, no emotional speech, no moment where I pointed at 21 years of disappointment and demanded an explanation. Real life rarely works that way. Most lasting changes begin quietly. They begin when a person becomes tired of negotiating with reality. The following Monday, I woke up at 6 like always. Coffee brewed. The morning news played softly from the television. The sky outside carried that gray Ohio color that makes everything look half asleep. Claire came downstairs around 7. Normally, I would have already packed her lunch. It was a habit I had kept for years. Turkey sandwich, fruit, a bottle of water. Small things, thoughtful things. That morning I did not. She opened the refrigerator and looked around. "Did we run out of lunch meat?" she asked. "I'm not sure," I said. "You would have to check." She nodded and made herself breakfast. The conversation lasted less than 20 seconds. What surprised me was not her reaction. It was mine. For years, I had attached emotional meaning to every small act of service. I convinced myself those routines were proof of love. But sitting there with my coffee, I realized most of them had become obligations. Things I did automatically because I always had, not because anyone appreciated them. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I stopped managing every detail of our shared life. Not out of anger, out of honesty. If two people were truly partners, responsibilities could be shared. If we were simply roommates, then roommates handled their own schedules, their own errands, their own forgotten appointments. Claire did not notice at first. Or maybe she noticed and assumed it was temporary. Either way, life continued. Thursday evening I came home and found 3 burned-out light bulbs still hanging above the kitchen island. Normally I would have replaced them immediately. Claire glanced upward. One of these days we should fix those. I looked up too. Probably. Then I walked into the living room. For years I would have grabbed a ladder before she finished the sentence. That night I sat down and opened a book. The bulbs remained exactly where they were. A strange thing happens when you stop over-functioning in a relationship. You begin discovering how much effort you were contributing without realizing it. Friday afternoon, my manager called me into his office. We had been expanding operations into several neighboring states, and corporate leadership wanted someone to oversee a new regional logistics initiative. It would mean additional travel, more responsibility, better pay. 6 months earlier, I might have hesitated. I would have worried about how the schedule affected home life. That afternoon, I accepted before the meeting ended. Driving home, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Anticipation. Not because of the promotion itself, because I had made a decision entirely for myself. The realization felt unfamiliar. Somewhere over the past decade, I had stopped asking what I wanted from life. My goals had become maintenance goals. Preserve the marriage. Preserve the routine. Preserve stability. Now, for the first time in a long while, I was considering possibilities instead of obligations. That weekend, I joined a gym near the distribution center. Nothing dramatic. No midlife transformation montage. Just a membership card and a commitment to show up 3 mornings a week. Monday became Tuesday. Tuesday became Wednesday. Small choices started accumulating. Better meals. Longer walks. Earlier bedtimes. Less television. More reading. More focus. Claire occasionally noticed pieces of the change. One evening, she looked up from her phone as I headed toward the front door, wearing workout clothes. "You have been going there a lot lately." "I guess I have," I said. She studied me for a second before returning to her screen. The conversation ended there. But something important had already shifted. For years, I had measured my value through what I provided other people. What I fixed. What I organized. What I carried. Now I was slowly rediscovering a version of myself that existed outside those responsibilities. And the strangest part was this. The less energy I spent chasing connection, the clearer everything became. The silence inside the house no longer felt confusing. It felt informative. Every quiet dinner, every distracted conversation, every moment of emotional distance confirmed what I had finally accepted. I was not withdrawing from a healthy marriage. I was simply stopping the performance of one. The promotion changed more than my job title. It changed the shape of my days. By early November, I was spending time at facilities across Ohio, Indiana, and Western Pennsylvania, meeting with managers, reviewing expansion plans, and solving problems that actually challenged me. For the first time in years, I felt engaged. Not distracted. Not busy. Engaged. There is a difference. Busy fills your schedule. Purpose fills your mind. I had forgotten what that felt like. The highways became familiar. Long stretches of interstate lined with bare trees and truck stops glowing against the cold evening sky. I started listening to audiobooks during the drive instead of replaying conversations in my head. I started making plans instead of excuses. Every week seemed to open another door. At the gym, I met people who knew nothing about my marriage, nothing about my history, nothing about the version of me that had spent years trying to hold together something that was already drifting apart. To them, I was simply Grant. A guy showing up consistently at 6 in the morning. A guy making progress. A guy with goals. It sounds simple, but after years of defining myself through a relationship, being seen as an individual again felt surprisingly powerful. Meanwhile, life at home continued along its familiar tracks. Or at least that was what Claire seemed to believe. One Thursday evening, I arrived home later than usual after a meeting outside Pittsburgh. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Claire sat at the island eating takeout and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I walked in. "You are home late." "Traffic near the state line," I said. She nodded. "There is food in the refrigerator if you want some." That was the entire exchange. 21 years together reduced to the conversational depth of neighbors discussing weather. Yet something about it no longer hurt the way it once would have. Pain often comes from expectation. And my expectations were changing. A few days later, I spent Saturday afternoon walking through a bookstore downtown. Years ago, I would have rushed home after errands because I felt guilty spending time away from the house. That afternoon, I wandered through aisles for nearly 2 hours. History, business, travel. I bought 3 books and stopped for coffee before heading home. When I walked through the front door, Claire looked surprised. I texted you earlier. I checked my phone. The message had arrived while it was on silent. Sorry, I did not see it. She stared at me for a second. You usually answer right away. The comment caught my attention because she was right. I always had. No matter where I was. No matter what I was doing. I had trained myself to remain immediately available. I was out, I said simply. She nodded but seemed distracted afterward. Looking back, I think that was one of the first moments she noticed something changing. Not because I did anything dramatic. Because I stopped revolving around her schedule. The weeks continued passing. Thanksgiving approached. Temperatures dropped. Christmas decorations appeared across the neighborhood. One evening, I found myself standing in the driveway after work watching lights flicker on along the street. Families moved inside warm houses. Children carried boxes from garages. Somewhere nearby, somebody was playing holiday music. The air smelled faintly like wood smoke. For years, I had associated happiness with preserving the life I already had. Standing there beneath a darkening sky, I realized happiness might actually require building something new. That thought stayed with me. Later that night, Claire mentioned that several friends had commented on photographs from a company event. You look different lately, she said while loading dishes into the dishwasher. Different how? I asked. She shrugged. I do not know. Healthier maybe. I thanked her and continued reading. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but after she walked away, I noticed something unusual. It was the first personal observation she had made about me in months. Maybe longer. I sat there staring at the page without turning it. Because another realization had quietly arrived. The more I invested in my own life, the more visible I seemed to become. And for the first time since that birthday party, I had the strange feeling that Claire was beginning to notice the space I no longer occupied. By December, the changes were impossible to miss. Not because I announced them. Not because I demanded attention. Simply because absence has a way of becoming visible. For years, I had filled spaces without realizing it. I planned things. Remembered things. Initiated conversations. Suggested dinners. Checked schedules. Smoothed rough edges. Once those habits disappeared, the empty spaces remained. One Tuesday evening, I came home after a long day in Cincinnati and found Claire sitting alone at the kitchen island. Her laptop was open but untouched. The television was off. The house felt unusually quiet. How was your trip? She asked as I set down my overnight bag. The question caught me slightly off guard. She had not asked about my work travel in months. Productive, I said. We finalized the expansion timeline. She nodded. That is good. Normally the conversation would have ended there. Instead, she hesitated. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. Like someone reaching for a door handle and deciding not to open it. You seem busy lately, she said. I have been busy. Another pause. More than usual. I smiled politely. The new role comes with more responsibility. She looked down at the counter. Right. Then she returned to her laptop. Small moment. Easy to miss. But something about it stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, similar moments started appearing. Claire would ask where I was going when I left for the gym. She would ask how long a meeting lasted. She would ask whether I planned to be home for dinner. None of the questions were dramatic. Yet they felt different because for years she had shown almost no curiosity at all. The closer Christmas came, the more noticeable it became. One Saturday afternoon, I spent several hours downtown buying gifts and meeting a colleague for coffee. When I returned home, Claire was standing near the front window. I tried calling earlier, she said. My phone was in the truck. She looked relieved in a way that seemed completely out of proportion to the situation. Oh, okay. Looking back, I think she was experiencing something she had not expected. Uncertainty. For years, she had operated with complete confidence about one thing. No matter what happened, I would always be there. Available. Predictable. Reliable. A permanent fixture. Now that certainty was beginning to crack. Not because I threatened to leave. Because I stopped centering my entire existence around being present. The realization seemed to unsettle her. One evening a few days before Christmas, we attended a neighborhood gathering. Many of the same couples we had known for years were there. Holiday music played softly through the house. Children ran between rooms carrying cookies and cups of hot chocolate. At one point, I found myself talking with several people about the regional expansion project. The conversation lasted maybe 15 minutes. When I glanced across the room, I noticed Claire watching. Not casually. Intentionally. The expression disappeared the moment our eyes met, but I had seen it. Curiosity. Maybe even concern. Later that night during the drive home, she seemed unusually quiet. The road stretched ahead beneath a clear winter sky. Christmas lights glowed from front porches and rooftops across the neighborhood. Finally she spoke. "You seem happier lately." The comment lingered in the air between us. I thought carefully before answering. "I think I am." She stared out the passenger window. "That is good." But her voice sounded different than the words themselves. Not angry. Not resentful. Confused. As though my happiness did not fit the story she expected. When we pulled into the driveway, neither of us moved immediately. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. Christmas lights reflected across the windshield. Then Claire asked a question that surprised me. "Are we okay?" I looked at her for a moment. The woman beside me had spent years drifting away without noticing the distance. Now she was finally looking back across it. "I do not know," I answered honestly. And for the first time since that birthday party, she did not seem comfortable with the uncertainty. The weeks after Christmas carried a strange tension through the house. Nothing dramatic. No arguments. No accusations. Just the quiet awareness that something important had shifted and neither of us knew exactly what came next. January arrived with snow piled along curbs and gray skies hanging over central Ohio like a heavy blanket. Work continued pulling me in new directions. The regional project had become one of the company's biggest priorities, and for the first time in years I found myself genuinely excited about Monday mornings. There is something powerful about waking up with purpose. It changes the way a man walks into a room. It changes the way he carries himself. Most importantly, it changes what he is willing to tolerate. One Thursday evening, our executive team hosted a dinner at a steakhouse downtown to celebrate the completion of a major expansion phase. Nothing extravagant, just good food, good conversation, and a chance to recognize months of effort. Employees were welcome to bring spouses. When I mentioned it earlier that week, Claire immediately said she wanted to attend. That surprised me. For years, she had treated company events like obligations. This time, she seemed almost eager. The restaurant overlooked the river. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected city lights across the dark water. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation. Managers introduced spouses. People shared stories from the road. Laughter drifted between tables. It felt warm, comfortable, alive. Several colleagues greeted me the moment we arrived. Questions about future projects. Congratulations on recent results. Discussions about upcoming travel. I noticed Claire watching those conversations carefully. Not suspiciously. More like someone seeing a familiar place through a different lens. At one point, a vice president from corporate joined our table and spent nearly 20 minutes discussing long-term leadership opportunities with me. When he finally moved on, Claire sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked, "Has that been happening often?" "What?" I said. "People talking to you like that." I smiled slightly. "It is part of the job." She looked down at her glass. "I guess I never realized how much responsibility you have." The comment landed harder than she probably intended. Not because it was insulting, because it was honest. She never realized. Somewhere over the years, she had stopped paying attention. Later in the evening, several couples gathered near the windows while dessert was served. Conversations drifted from careers to travel plans to retirement goals. Someone asked Claire how long we had been married. 21 years, she answered. The woman smiled. "That is impressive. You two seem very steady." For a brief second, I saw something flash across Claire's face. Not pride, not happiness, something closer to regret. She forced a smile and changed the subject. The drive home was unusually quiet. Snow flurries moved through the headlights in soft waves. The city disappeared behind us as we made our way toward the suburbs. Finally, Claire spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She stared out the windshield. "Have you been unhappy for a long time?" The question settled heavily between us. I thought about lying. I thought about giving her an easy answer. Instead, I told the truth. "I think I was lonely for a long time." She swallowed hard, but did not look at me. "Why did you never say anything?" I almost laughed at the irony. Not because it was funny, because I had spent years saying it in 100 different ways. Through invitations, through conversations, through effort, through patience, through showing up. "I did," I said quietly. Maybe not with those exact words, but I did. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, neither of us rushed inside. Snow rested across the lawn. Porch lights glowed along the street. The neighborhood looked frozen in place. Claire finally turned toward me. Her eyes looked tired. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. Like someone realizing they had overlooked something important for far too long. "I do not know when things changed," she whispered. I looked out across the quiet street before answering. "That is the problem." Then I opened the door and stepped into the cold night air, leaving her alone with a question she could no longer avoid. After that night, something changed in Claire. Not immediately, not dramatically, but the shift was there. The same way you notice winter ending before the snow fully disappears. Small signs, subtle signs, signs that only matter when you have spent years paying attention. She started coming downstairs earlier in the morning. She started asking questions about my travel schedule. She started lingering in rooms instead of passing through them. One Saturday, she suggested we have breakfast together at a diner we used to visit years ago. The request surprised me enough that I almost asked her to repeat it. Instead, I simply said yes. The diner sat on the edge of town beside an old gas station and a hardware store. The place had not changed much. Same cracked vinyl booths. Same smell of coffee and bacon. Same waitress who somehow remembered everyone's order. Claire sat across from me, stirring cream into her coffee while snow melted outside the windows. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she looked up and asked a question that felt years overdue. "When did you stop talking to me?" I almost smiled. Not because the question was unreasonable, because it revealed how differently we remembered the same marriage. "I did not stop talking," I said quietly. "I stopped repeating myself." The words seemed to land harder than I intended. Claire looked down at the table. For a long moment, she traced circles through a drop of condensation beside her glass. "I never meant for us to become this," she said. Neither did I. The truth hung between us. Uncomfortable. Honest. Neither of us could argue with it. The weeks that followed felt strangely unfamiliar. Claire made efforts. Real efforts. She suggested dinners. She asked questions. She put her phone away during conversations. Some evenings she sat beside me on the couch instead of across the room. Months earlier, those changes would have felt like victories. Now they felt complicated. Because something important had happened while she was not paying attention. I had learned how to live without waiting. One evening in February, I returned home after a 2-day trip to Indianapolis. The house was quiet except for the sound of a dishwasher running in the kitchen. Claire was sitting at the table when I walked in. No television. No phone. Just sitting there. Waiting. "Can we talk?" she asked. There was something different in her voice. Not confidence. Not frustration. Vulnerability. I sat down across from her. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she took a slow breath. "I feel like I am losing you." The words settled into the silence. Funny thing about hearing something you once wanted desperately. Sometimes it arrives too late. I looked at her carefully. The woman sitting across from me was not cruel. She was not malicious. She was simply confronting a reality she had ignored for years. "Why do you think that?" I asked. Her eyes filled with frustration. "Because everything feels different. You are different. You do not need me the way you used to." There it was. The sentence neither of us had been willing to say out loud. I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the dark kitchen window. My reflection stared back at me. Older, calmer, clearer. Then I turned back toward her. "Because you already lost me," I said gently. "You just did not notice when it happened." Claire looked as though the air had left the room. I continued before she could respond. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Because she deserved the truth. "I spent years trying to connect with you. Years. I planned things. Started conversations. Asked questions. Reached for you. Eventually, I got tired of knocking on a door that never opened." Her eyes filled with tears. She seemed determined not to let fall. I did not realize. I nodded slowly. "That is exactly the problem." The room fell silent. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background. Somewhere outside, a car passed along the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different. Because for the first time in years, we were no longer talking about schedules or errands or obligations. We were finally talking about the truth. And judging by the look in Claire's eyes, she was beginning to understand that some distances take years to create, but only one moment to finally see. The conversation in the kitchen changed something neither of us could take back. Not because it ended our marriage. The truth was, our marriage had been struggling long before that night. What changed was that neither of us could pretend anymore. For the first time in years, everything was out in the open. The following weeks felt different. Claire stopped moving through life on autopilot. She paid attention. She asked questions. She listened to answers. Sometimes we sat together after dinner and talked for an hour. Real conversations. The kind we used to have years ago. The kind that had slowly disappeared without either of us noticing. One evening in early spring, we sat on the back patio, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air carried that first hint of warmth after a long Ohio winter. Birds moved between branches. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet they felt important because we had spent so many years missing them. Claire wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and stared into the fading light. "I keep thinking about that night at the birthday party," she said quietly. I knew exactly which night she meant. "I do too." She looked down at the mug. "I thought I was making a joke." I nodded. "I know." Her voice trembled slightly. "But looking back, I think it was worse than a joke. I think it was the truth. At least the truth about how I had started seeing us." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Honesty has a weight to it. The real kind. The kind that arrives too late to change the past, but just in time to understand it. "I stopped seeing what was right in front of me," she said. "I stopped appreciating you. I stopped paying attention." The words hung in the air between us. No excuses. No blame. Just accountability. And strangely enough, that mattered more than any apology could have. I looked out across the backyard. The fence needed staining. The flower beds needed work. Life still had imperfections. It always would. "We both made mistakes," I said. "But the difference is that one of us noticed there was a problem before the other." Claire wiped at her eyes and laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." For the first time in a very long time, I laughed too. Not because everything was fixed. Not because all the hurt had disappeared. But because the conversation felt real. Months earlier, I would have given anything for that. Looking back now, I realized something important. The moment that changed my life was not when I started focusing on myself. It was when I stopped waiting for someone else to make me feel valued. Once I did that, everything became clearer. My confidence returned. My purpose returned. My sense of self returned. Whether a relationship survives or not, no one should have to lose themselves in order to keep it alive. Claire and I did not magically become the couple we were 20 years earlier. Real life is not a movie. But we did something better. We started paying attention again. We started treating each other like people instead of assumptions. And sometimes that is where healing begins. Not with grand gestures. Not with dramatic speeches. Just with finally seeing what has been standing in front of you all along. The last thing I will say is this. The day someone stops feeling appreciated is rarely the day they leave emotionally. Most of the time, that departure happened long before. The real danger is not conflict. The real danger is indifference. Because indifference is quiet. It does not announce itself. It simply grows until one day, two people wake up and realize they have become strangers sharing an address. If you have ever experienced something similar, I would genuinely like to know your thoughts. What do you think was the turning point in this story? And if these stories about relationships, self-respect, and second chances resonate with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next one. Sometimes a single story can help us see our own lives a little more clearly. As for me, I learned a lesson I will never forget. The day she stopped seeing me as a husband was painful. But the day I finally remembered my own value changed everything.